So the first Roca Gallery opened in Barcelona in 2009, and it's now a project that covers 6 galleries worldwide, as well as the digital gallery platform rocagallery.com. Now, all of the physical galleries function in the same way, that they form a flagship showroom for the brand, but they also host a program of exhibitions and events which explore topics from the worlds of architecture and design. And that gives some idea of the sort of brief that was given to the team at Zaha Hadid.
Zaha Hadid Architects was approached in January 2009 to work on this project. The team was quite a small team that worked on the project, and the project was between design and completion took close to 2 years. The building itself was originally designed to house, 5 different units on the ground floor. It was never meant to be an open plan layout. And when we took on the site, there was a lot for us to deal with regarding limitations with columns. I think we had close to 20 columns floating within the space. Looking at the concept that we wanted to achieve about fluidity and openness, it was sort of difficult for us to deal with those columns and have them within the project. And a lot of our design had to somehow work around these columns to incorporate them into the structure and into the flesh and the walls of the architecture to ensure that fluidity that we wanted to achieve with the experience of the space. One of the ideas were for us to actually take water as an inspiration for the project and use the different states of water and translate that into the architecture, whether physically or through the experience of the space. And initially, we started looking at, condensation, at droplets, water, fluidity, tried to connect to the river, which is not too far from the site. So all in all, the idea came from, taking a solid mass and throwing water at it and carving it out and eroding it to creating those spaces. And I think you can see that from the facade. The facade is made out of concrete. Fiber concrete. The idea was that you're piercing through that facade into some of the environments that are also made out of concrete.
Experimenting with material is one of our key to our project. I don't think we always start with like one material. We start with many different materials. We may be able to do the job, but that's how we set up the whole agenda about our project. So for the Roca showroom, I think we look at concrete, we look at GLG, we actually look at solid surface as well, because it's allowed us to also have the idea of this seamless without joint if we want to. We kind of always experiment with different things. We contact the different fabricator and they come up with like a mock-up, and then we choose from there what is the best for the project. I think the most important thing is also the drive of the company, which have the same passion as the designer. So we're willing to go a step further. I can't remember how many like gallery they have in all parts of the world. What also exciting is they also go to the local designer or the best of the region, and they probably know best about the culture and the content about the building itself, and it gives each one a different touch to the project. We also like the idea of like a secretive. So this small one, but you can still look into the space. And it's kind of playing with curiosity, and that's why you have like small window. All of a sudden you realize, actually, you look in the space and there's someone there, or there's an object inside, or there's a light coming down from the cone.
MT is a construction company that started in Spain, although now it's spread around the world with projects in Middle East and all around Europe. And it is specialized in museum fit-out and high-end retail. We were approached by Roca to build the new flagship store in Barcelona, and since that experience went well, then Roca considered MT to be the main contractor for the new flagship store in London. Something particular about MT is that most of the management team, the project managers, are either architects or engineers, and that helped, I think, to build up a good relationship and in the understanding of what was it that we all wanted to achieve. For this project, on the project management side, there were 5 architects which were involved from day one on the development of the project. And so we almost ended up acting as a hinge between the more crude construction and the design world and how were those things put in together. This project was very much based on prototypes, samples and mock-ups. And that's why these workshops also became really important, because it was the method in which we could then progress into those mock-ups and then build it up. And you have to bear in mind that most of the solutions that we see around were custom made, from the tiles to the panels, but also to the lighting or the supports, and even the frames for TVs or the way that the products are hung. And all this prototyping, all these custom made products needed prototyping, and that was the key to achieve what we can see. We also needed a full-size mock-up where things could be tested. This is something that sometimes the client see as an unnecessary expense, but I think it was really the key to the success of the building of the project. So we built a section of the showroom, a 5 meters by 3 meters slice, which was chosen by the team of Zaha Hadid Architects. So I think they spent some time looking at what would be the most complicated part of the showroom, and they marked it in a plan, and that was the bit that we built. And it incorporated everything from the floor to the wall panels, but also the connections to hang the sanitary ware, TVs, most importantly, all the lighting, and then how all that was put together. That section covered part of the concrete environments and also part of the gallery space, which is finished in gypsum, so that we could see all the finishes. And it also showed the most tight of the curvatures and how all these materials met. So it was through this mock-up, for example, when we realized that it was not sufficient to just build in the 3D model the surface that the concrete environments had. Once those panels were built and they were put together, the joint between the panels, if it was built at 90 degrees off the surface of the concrete panels, it meant that the joints would not meet perfectly. So through the process of this mock-up, it became apparent that in the 3D model, the team from Zaha Hadid Architects would not only have to model the surface of the materials, they would also have to model the thickness of those materials, the way that the joint would be cut, and at what angle was that meeting the surface.
For the concept stages, the software we use mostly in the office is Maya. It's an easy software to use to produce ideas quickly before we settle on one and move into construction drawings. So for us, using Maya is a very easy tool and quick tool to come up with ideas. Working with Zaha has taught us to try and produce as many ideas as possible at beginning stage and try and zoom into the right solution for the project. So that's a good tool for us to use to be able to translate our ideas into paper. Following that, I think it was important for us to become more precise, and using Rhino takes that step further with precision. And knowing that MT also used Rhino as a software to develop their work, it was the best way to somehow communicate between us and the contractor to translate all our ideas into a product. The problems we had during the development of the project were where most of the consultants or the lighting consultants and the engineers did not work with either of the softwares, and they were more traditional in that sense, and MT was a very good tool to use as a team to bridge that communication between our software and the consultants on site. Having said that, this somehow pushed us to actually model everything into the software. When designing, we had to actually go in and run every single pipe, wire, machine that would run in the space or behind the walls of the space to ensure that everything fit properly. Since everything was being prefabricated before coming to site, with these panels, it was really difficult to actually add on things afterwards on site. So every single screw or hole or socket or panel, computer panel that needed to be incorporated into those concrete panels had to be pre-decided and included into the 3D model so that when it went to fabrication, it was all in place. So with that, somehow everything had to be figured out ahead of time before we went into the production of the panels. And that meant when we came on site, everything was fitting into place as expected. The client approached us to design a space that catered to various activities. So it wasn't just a place to come and look at product. It was creating a culture for people to come and learn from. And part of that, it was very important that we catered for a space to house exhibitions, and that would develop further down to becoming a program into the space where exhibitions would come for a few months and then they would move to different programs. So the space organization was based on a center core, which was the gallery space, where the exhibition also took space. From that, you could extend into the environments where we exhibited the product. So the whole idea behind the showroom was to have flexibility in display and flexibility in use.
It's interesting to see how people adopt the space, meaning using it as like photographic exhibition, architecture school coming in to do their installation, or how they react to such a space. It's exciting because it's not just a usual white box. Being, in the office for such a long time, you kind of develop certain way of displaying stuff because of what Zaha preference. So that's a certain way. Also, like we were looking at the light, we always like cluster them. We never like put things around here and there. We always create a story behind, whether it's a painting, it's an object.
The team from Zaha Hadid Architects had developed a very complex geometry for the showroom, but I think that they were very clever in then limiting the palette of material to be used so that then all these flowing sense could be transmitted without being overwhelmed by too many different things touching each other. So really the palette was concentrated on the materials that could achieve these free-flowing surfaces. It was down to glass reinforced concrete, GRC, which was used for all the environments where we have the products displayed. Then GRG is glass reinforced gypsum, is the white material that was used for the central spine of the project, which is the gallery space. And then we had GRP, that's glass reinforced polyester, and it is the very shiny material that was used for the furniture, lighting, tables, and the pieces which stand out from the background of walls and floors.
Working with fiber concrete, gypsum, and GRP was a choice, knowing the complexity of the forms that we are using within that project. For us, on one hand, the texture of the materials was important, what we were achieving out of those materials. It was very important to achieve a contrast between the exhibited items and the ironmongery and the panels, the concrete panels. So the finish that we wanted on those panels was a matte finish, sort of a velvety finish, so that it goes in contrast with the product that's being displayed. Moving on to the furniture pieces, we used GRP for that. And the reason for that, we wanted the gloss finish, polished, completed finish on the furniture to somehow duplicate the look of the ceramics in the product displayed in the environment.
We searched for manufacturers in the UK and also in the rest of Europe. We found several manufacturers that could do glass reinforced gypsum, but not so many that could do glass reinforced concrete. And out of those, the very large companies that deal with concrete would not be interested in getting involved in something so little and at the same time complicated. And the smaller companies would not be prepared to take on board this challenge. So it was key to find somebody that could make it, and this came in the form of a company based in Germany called B&T Bau. It is a company, but in reality it is run by a person. The CEO of the company is Kruno Talek. He had at the time developed a patent for a fire-resistant concrete panel, which was very slim. He had already tested it so that it was already compliant with fire regulations, which was key for this project. But it was also innovative in that it incorporated a panel, a board of aluminum inside his concrete panel, which made it a lot lighter than solid concrete panel. So all of these made this patented material something very adequate for the job. In order to fabricate them, there needs to be a mold made. This mold is made out of polystyrene. And another particularity of this company is that at the time they already had a CNC robot with an arm that was a 7-axis robot. So it could move in many directions and had several joints in the arm. The companies that we had found in the UK had CNC robots with 5 axes and therefore could not make some of those very complicated curvatures of the panels. So this polystyrene mold was made starting from a big block that was then carved by the robot. Then smooth agent was applied onto it, made out of gypsum with fiberboard so that it was resistant. Then we had a release agent applied onto it, and then the concrete was poured to fabricate the panels. The panels themselves are 60 millimeters thick, so it has about 10 millimeters of concrete with glass fiber. Then there's the aluminum core, which is another 40 millimeters. And then we have another 10 millimeters of concrete with fiberboard. And this concrete goes all around. And when the whole process is completed, then we end up with a sandwich panel, which can then be lifted, and it is about a quarter of the weight that we would have if it had been a solid panel, but it is a lot more strong and easy to handle. There was a challenge that we found along this process, which is how the first panels that arrived after a long journey from Germany to London had suffered from traveling on a flat lorry for such a distance, and when they arrived here, they had cracks in several parts of the surface. The panels are designed and built to be able to take their own load and stand, but if you place them on the corners onto a flatbed lorry, then the journey was too much for them to come in the perfect conditions that we expected. So we had to then look for a solution to that, and the conclusion was that the best thing to protect them was to send them with their own mold. This had, however, two consequences. The first consequence is that where in any track we would have expected to receive, say, 6 panels per track, now we could only fit 2 or 3. Suddenly the number of tracks we needed to bring to the site and unload multiplied. But it was something that we could manage. There was yet another consequence to this, which is that when we left the panels for longer in the mold, we found out that the mold was so perfect in the surface that when the panels were struck, the surface came very shiny. It came as if it was a polished marble stone that had just been polished to be set on site. The team from Zaha Hadid Architects wanted that surface to be matte, and this had a very good reason, which is that this matte surface in the background would emphasize the sanitary ware products, which are made of vitroceramics and therefore stand out. When we reached to this point in the construction, we could not stop the production and look for other ways of building the panels. We had to carry on and build all the panels and assemble them together. And then towards the end of the construction sequence, B&T Bau found a release agent that when applied to the molds, it made them matte. This is something that is a particular product that is used on the tumble-turn trucks that carry concrete around. But by the time that it was discovered that this release agent would leave the panels matte, there were only 6 panels left to be fabricated. Everything else in the gallery had to be sanded down to remove the shiny finish of the surface. So we closed the site for a week, brought in a crew of workers wearing masks and all kind of PPE, and had all the panels sanded so that we could go back to that matte finish that was required. There were several tricky panels in the production process. Some were tricky because of the size, some were tricky because they had several cuts in them or perforations for speakers or screens. The one behind the reception desk is tricky because it is almost like a semi-sphere. If you imagine a big block of polystyrene making a semi-sphere in which you then had to pour the concrete. The concrete is poured on a liquid form, and all the concrete slurs to the side. And that meant that then at the base we would have a very thick panel, and at the top we would have a very, very thin shell. In order to overcome this, they had to be particularly careful on this panel and pour the concrete in very thin layers of millimeter with fiberglass, then wait for it to settle a bit before pouring the next layer, and so on until that initial centimeter of concrete was achieved before they could progress. We tried several methods of arranging the setting out of the panels. We had already done a 3D scan of the space before the construction started, so we had that on a very precise 3D model. And we tried to use that as a way of then using this 3D scanning to set out the panels. It didn't work. We also tried setting out in a more traditional way with a topographer marking points, but it wasn't precise enough so that the panels could be located in position. And in the end, we developed another method, which was to fabricate plywood templates of how the panels would be meeting the ground. And then they consisted of just big panels of plywood in which we had cut out the shape of the base of the panels. We would lay down these plywood panels on the floor and cover the whole floor area. And because these panels do have straight edges, we could relay those to the orthogonal axis of the space. Then through these cutouts, we could paint on the floor the setout of the panels, had it approved by the Zaha Hadid Architects team so that we were all happy with that starting point, and then take it as the guidance to build the wall panels. The ceiling panels are suspended from the slab above. This means that for each panel there are at least 6 rods that go to fixings embedded into the concrete slab. We had the advantage that the floor above us is used by offices, and therefore the concrete slab is a lot thicker than it would have been for a residential development. So we could support all these panels hanging from the ceiling, and it was a matter of actually drilling all those holes and inserting the rods and hanging the ceiling panels. Once the ceiling panels and the wall panels were in place, everything is connected and it ends up almost working as a dome environment.
Part of the design process, Roca wanted us to try and to go into the designing of a tile for the company. Our approach was a bit different to other designers. Instead of actually going in and designing a print or a texture, we wanted to design a pattern, a flow, something that worked with the concept of the project. We wanted to design a pattern that actually guide you through the project and walk the visitor through the spaces. So for us, it was very important, the lines and the grid that we created onto those tiles. So instead of actually going and designing a tile, we went with an existing tile and created the pattern and created a grid that took on close to 1,200 pieces. And with that, we needed to create a script to try and accommodate our pattern into the existing limitations of the tiles, which were 120 by 60 centimeters. So we wanted to ensure that our grid would fit within those limitations, but at the same time, it worked with the layout that we were trying to achieve. In addition to that complexity, we put on limitations to ourselves, where the joints that occurred between the vertical tiles, for us, with the concrete tiles, we wanted sort of a connection between those vertical lines into the floor grid. So we wanted that connection to meet. And for that, we had to actually go back into 3D scanning the space again to ensure where those lines happen and try and use that information into our system, into the software, and then run a script again with the tile limitation to achieve the pattern that we wanted.
We would then receive a crate, very beautifully presented, with all the tiles for a certain area. Each tile was numbered at the back, and we had the plan marked with all the numbers, which we would then pin on the wall and follow as if it was a jigsaw. The challenge in here was also how to set out the tiles in the space, because if in a normal situation, the tiler, say in a kitchen or a bathroom, would start from a straight wall and set out the tiles from there so that you can lay them down. In here, we did not have such a straight wall to start from. So we ended up solving it by fabricating one additional layer of tiles, which was located at the edge of the flooring. This additional layer of tiles would have one side following the curvature that was expected, and the other side would finish straight. So we could set out this straight line in the space related to the axis, then lay down the initial row of tiles, and from then on lay everything else in the floor.
With the design, with fluidity, we wanted to use light also fluidly to guide, the visitor through the architecture and the project. And we wanted the various spaces to have different sets, different moods, and different impacts. And with that, the core, which is made out of white gypsum, was lit indirectly by droplets in the ceiling. We used going back to water and the idea of droplets, we used those as a form to create a chandelier, let's say, to indirectly light the space. And those droplets manifest themselves down into shelving areas, and also those were lit indirectly from behind to light up the walls and wash light onto the walls. With the environment, the approach was quite different. We had a channel cut into the concrete panels on the ceiling, where we had spots introduced to somehow light up, to light up areas within the environment. So it's more about spotlighting and focusing on an element or a product, sort of, bringing back this whole idea of a museum or a gallery to give that feel to the visitor. And in that way, they were all set up in clusters of 3, but we were, there was flexibility of lighting one spotlight at a time, or 2 or 3. So there was always this flexibility of playing with the light to sort of change the space, whether it was being used in the day for a lecture, or if it was used in the night for a launching event. So there was a way of playing with the light to create different moods. There's some also important character within those environments, which was also formally introduced in the three environments, where we had sort of an area which we considered like an exploration area, where you had, with the tiles, you're moving your visitor through, going around the whole space reaching into an area where we call them, it's the cone area, a cone of light, basically. It's sort of enhancing the experience into the space. And you reach an area where we have a cone of light that comes from the ceiling, from a parasol used to sort of diffuse the light into a white concrete wall. So in those areas, we have only 3 areas where we use a lighter concrete rather than the darker one used in all the environments. And that area is sort of to accentuate the presentation of the product. And that is accentuated also with the wash of light from the ceiling.
You see what's actually going on within the gallery without separating yourself, but at the same time not distracted. So you're aware of what's going on within the space, always. The carpet, when I first joined the office, there was this famous orange carpet. And we actually went back to the same manufacturer, like 30 years later, to create this, and using exactly the same technique, which is a cutout. It's like old school. So it's like we're sitting in a space like it could be just like this for the next 50 years, 100 years, still look like a futuristic. But the technique, what we're using here is high-tech, low-tech. So in particular, when you mentioned about the carpet, it actually bring back lots of memory, how we used to work. And we still adopting the same idea to create stuff. But of course, with the help of the technology nowadays, you can pretty much create a lot of stuff without breaking the bank. So, yeah.
Most of the furniture in the project was bespoke. The reason for that was we wanted to ensure that everything was discreet, hidden, functional, and served the client best to its requirements. The reception, not that many pieces in the project. We've got few shelves for display. We've got the reception desk, which is designed to incorporate computer, printers, wiring. In addition to that, the requirements for the conference room was to have more of a flexible room where you could actually have 2 separate meetings at the same time or one big board meeting. So for that, we designed a table that is in 2 pieces so that it can be split or put together, but at the same time, the table housed all the wiring necessary for a conference room. That also included an area which housed the projector in the ceiling, and that was also designed in one big element that was actually raised in one go because of the size of it. It needed to be lifted in one element. In the whole project, the approach was always, we tried to imagine the scenario of actually building and moving things into construction from before moving into sites. So everything had to be pre-organized, all to the smallest detail.